Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Tin Foil Hat channel. Tonight we're going to drift slowly into one of the oldest mysteries ever whispered about in human history. A story that has survived thousands of years, crossing oceans, languages, and entire civilizations. A story about a place that may have existed long before the world we know today, and may have vanished in a single moment. Tonight, we're going to relax into the mystery of Atlantis. Some say it was the most advanced civilization that ever lived. Others believe it was only a myth, a warning story told by ancient philosophers. And some believe the truth sits somewhere in between, hidden beneath the ocean, buried under ice, or lost in records that never survived the passing of time. But before we go deeper into the mystery, if you enjoy these slow, relaxing journeys into forgotten history, hidden science, and strange theories the world never fully explained, make sure to subscribe to Sleepy Tin Foil Hat and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always like seeing how far these sleepy signals travel. Some of you are listening late at night, some early in the morning, and some somewhere in between, just looking for a quiet place to let your mind drift. Now settle in. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your breathing slow down. And let the noise of the day fade into the background. Because the story of Atlantis doesn't begin with the ocean. It begins with a philosopher. More than 2,000 years ago, in ancient Greece, a man named Plato wrote about a lost civilization that existed long before his time. Plato wasn't just a storyteller. He was one of the most influential thinkers in history. His writings shaped philosophy, science, politics, and the way people understood the world for centuries. And in two of his works, called Timaeus and Critias, he described a powerful island nation that existed beyond the known world. According to Plato, Atlantis was not a small place. It was a vast island, larger than many countries, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which most historians believe refers to the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond that narrow opening between Europe and Africa, Plato said there was a great ocean, and in that ocean, there was Atlantis. He described it as a civilization with incredible technology for its time, massive cities, advanced engineering, and a society that was wealthy, organized, and powerful. The Atlanteans built enormous temples covered in shining metals. They carved canals through the land. They created harbors large enough for hundreds of ships. They understood mathematics, astronomy, and architecture at a level that sounded impossible for the ancient world. And yet, according to the story, Atlantis did not fall slowly. It disappeared in a single day and night. Plato wrote that after a great catastrophe, earthquakes shook the land, the sea rose, and the entire island sank beneath the ocean, leaving nothing behind except a memory. For centuries, most people believed the story was only a metaphor. Plato often used fictional places to teach philosophical ideas, so historians assumed Atlantis was just a lesson about pride, power, and the dangers of corruption. But the strange part is, Plato wrote about Atlantis as if it was real. He claimed the story came from older records, passed down through Egyptian priests, who said the events happened thousands of years before Greece even existed. That detail alone has kept the mystery alive for over 2,000 years, because if the Egyptians really told that story, then the story is older than Plato. And if the story is older than Plato, then maybe Atlantis wasn't invented by him at all. And this is where the mystery starts to become more interesting. Ancient Egypt was one of the oldest recorded civilizations in history. Their priests kept careful records of kings, floods, stars, and events going back thousands of years. Greek visitors who traveled to Egypt often wrote about how the Egyptian priests spoke of civilizations that existed before the last great flood, before the current age of humanity. Some of those stories described lands that were destroyed by water, cities swallowed by the sea, and people who had knowledge that later civilizations forgot. These stories weren't only found in Egypt. Similar legends exist all over the world. In South America, there are myths about advanced people who came before the Inca. In India, ancient texts describe cities lost beneath the ocean. In the Middle East, there are stories of great floods that wiped out entire cultures. Even in Europe, old traditions speak about lands that sank beneath the waves long ago. When stories like that appear in many different places, it makes people wonder if they all come from the same forgotten event. And that's one of the reasons Atlantis never stopped fascinating people, because it sits right at the edge between myth and memory. Some researchers believe Plato's story might be based on a real disaster that happened thousands of years before recorded history. At the end of the last ice age, the world was very different. Huge glaciers covered much of the northern hemisphere. Sea levels were lower. Large areas of land existed that are now underwater. As the ice age ended, those glaciers melted. And when they melted, the oceans rose, slowly, then faster, then suddenly. Entire coastlines disappeared. Places where people once lived became part of the sea. If there were civilizations living near those ancient shores, they could have been lost without leaving much trace. And if survivors told stories about the land that vanished, those stories might have traveled across generations, changing a little each time, until they became legends. Legends like Atlantis. But there is another reason the Atlantis story feels different from other myths. Plato didn't describe a simple village. He described a civilization that sounded advanced, almost too advanced for its time. He talked about engineers who built perfect circles of land and water. He talked about metals that shined like fire. He talked about ships, armies, and machines that sounded far ahead of ancient technology. Because of that, some people started asking a strange question. What if Atlantis wasn't just ancient? What if it was advanced? Not advanced like modern technology, but advanced compared to the world that came after it. There are ruins around the world that seem older than the civilizations that supposedly built them. Massive stone blocks that are too heavy to move easily. Perfectly cut structures that show incredible precision. Ancient sites that appear suddenly in history with no clear explanation of how the knowledge developed. Some researchers believe these could be the remains of lost cultures. Cultures that existed before recorded history. Cultures that may have disappeared when the climate changed at the end of the Ice Age. And once people start thinking like that, Atlantis stops feeling like a simple myth. It starts feeling like a missing chapter, a chapter that might explain why so many ancient civilizations seem to appear already knowing things, why knowledge sometimes seems to show up suddenly, and why stories of a lost golden age exist in so many different traditions. Of course, there are also people who believe Atlantis was something even stranger. Not just a lost civilization, but a civilization with knowledge we don't fully understand yet. Some theories say the Atlanteans understood energy in ways we forgot. Others say they knew astronomy with incredible precision. Some even believe Atlantis was connected to ideas about forgotten science, ancient machines, or technologies that disappeared when the civilization fell. Most of these ideas are impossible to prove, but the fact that people keep asking the question, after thousands of years, says something about the story itself, because most myths fade away. Atlantis didn't. It stayed. It kept showing up in books, in research, in theories, in documentaries, and in quiet late-night conversations where people wonder if history is missing something. And the deeper you go into the story, the more it starts to feel like the mystery isn't only about a lost island. It's about how much of the past we really know, and how much might still be hidden. Because the ocean covers most of the planet, and under that water, there are places no one has ever explored. Ancient coastlines, sunken cities, and ruins that might never be found. Somewhere in those depths, if the story is true, Atlantis could still be there, waiting in the dark, silent, unchanged, forgotten by the world above. And the strange thing is, the search for Atlantis never really stopped. Not in ancient times, not in modern times, and not even today. Because every generation finds new clues, new theories, new places where the lost city might have been. And the next clue might be hiding in one of the oldest maps ever drawn. And the next clue might be hiding in one of the oldest maps ever drawn. Throughout history, there have been strange maps that seem to show places no one should have known about at the time. Maps drawn centuries ago, sometimes thousands of years ago, that appear to contain details that don't fully match what historians expect. One of the most talked about examples is the Piri Reis map, created in the early 1500s by an Ottoman admiral. At first glance, it looks like a normal map of the known world. But when researchers studied it more closely, they noticed something unusual. Parts of the map seem to show coastlines that were not officially discovered until much later. There are shapes that resemble South America, coastlines that look surprisingly accurate, and even features that some people believe could represent land that is now hidden under ice. Now, historians say the map was probably copied from older sources, combined from many earlier charts made by different sailors. That explanation makes sense. Sailors pass down knowledge all the time. But that raises another question. If the map was copied from older maps, how old were the originals? Some researchers believe that certain ancient maps may have been based on knowledge from civilizations that existed before the last ice age ended. During that time, sea levels were much lower. Land that is now underwater would have been above the surface. Coastlines would have looked very different from the ones we see today. If people were living along those ancient shores, they could have mapped the world as it looked back then. And when the oceans rose, those maps would have become records of a world that no longer existed. This idea fits strangely well with the story of Atlantis, because Plato said Atlantis existed before a great destruction, before floods, before the world changed. And if a civilization really did exist before the seas rose, its cities might now be far below the surface. Today, the ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth. Most of it has never been fully explored. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about the bottom of our own oceans. There are entire mountain ranges underwater, huge plains, deep trenches, and places where sunlight never reaches. If a city sank thousands of years ago, it could still be there, hidden under layers of sand, or buried beneath coral, or resting in a place no one has looked yet. Over the last 100 years, explorers have found ruins underwater in many parts of the world. Off the coast of India, structures have been discovered beneath the sea that look like walls and streets. Near Japan, there is a formation called Yonaguni, where massive stone shapes sit on the ocean floor, with sharp angles that look almost carved. In the Mediterranean, ancient ports and towns have been found underwater, flooded as sea levels rose. Most of these have normal explanations. Cities built near the coast, land sinking slowly, earthquakes, or natural rock formations that just happen to look artificial. But every time something like this is found, people think about Atlantis again, because the idea is always the same. What if there was one place, one civilization, that was larger, older, and more advanced than the others, and it disappeared before history began? Some theories say Atlantis might have been in the Atlantic Ocean, exactly where Plato described it. Others think it could have been in the Mediterranean, connected to ancient cultures like the Minoans. There are theories placing Atlantis near Antarctica, in the Caribbean, near the Azores, even under the Sahara Desert, when it was once green and full of rivers. Each theory tries to match parts of the story: a powerful island, advanced people, a sudden disaster, and a disappearance that left almost nothing behind. One of the most popular ideas connects Atlantis to the island of Santorini in Greece. Thousands of years ago, Santorini experienced one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history. The explosion was so powerful that it destroyed much of the island and created massive waves that spread across the Mediterranean. Some historians think this disaster could have inspired the story Plato later wrote about. The timing isn't perfect, the details don't match exactly, but the idea of a powerful island civilization destroyed by a sudden catastrophe fits surprisingly well. And when people see a real event that sounds similar to the legend, it makes the legend feel less impossible. But there are other theories that go much further. Some researchers believe Atlantis existed much earlier, not just a few thousand years ago, but 10,000 years ago or more. That would place it near the end of the last ice age, when the world was going through massive changes. During that time, temperatures rose quickly, glaciers melted, sea levels climbed hundreds of feet, entire regions disappeared underwater. There is scientific evidence that this period included sudden floods, violent storms, and dramatic shifts in climate. If a civilization existed before that time, it might not have survived the transition. And if survivors passed their stories down, those stories could have turned into myths of a lost golden age. Many ancient cultures talk about a time when the world was different, a time when people lived longer, when knowledge was greater, when disasters came and reset everything. In Greek mythology, there was a golden age before the present one. In Hindu tradition, there are cycles of civilization rising and falling. In many flood myths, people talk about a world that existed before the waters came. When the same idea appears in different places, it makes the mystery feel deeper, not proof, but something that makes people wonder. And Atlantis sits right in the middle of all those stories. Not fully history, not fully myth, but something that feels like it could be both. Another reason the Atlantis story never goes away is because of how detailed Plato's description was. He didn't just say there was an island. He described its shape, its layout, its buildings, its rulers, its wars. He even described the capital city as a series of perfect circles of land and water, connected by canals and bridges. That kind of detail feels unusual for a simple story. Some people think Plato invented those details to make the story more interesting. Others think he was repeating something he believed was real. And that difference between invention and memory is what keeps the mystery alive. Because if even a small part of the story is true, then something important might have been lost. Something older than recorded history. Something buried under the ocean. Something that could change the way we understand the past. And the strange thing is, the more technology we develop, the more we realize how much of the Earth we still haven't seen. Satellites can map the surface, but the deep ocean is still mostly unknown. There are valleys deeper than Mount Everest is tall, places where pressure is so strong that machines can barely survive, regions where no human has ever been. If Atlantis is real, it wouldn't be surprising if it was still down there. Silent, dark, covered by time. And sometimes, people think the clues to Atlantis aren't only underwater. Some believe the clues are hidden in ancient monuments, in strange alignments, in structures that seem too precise for their age. Because there are places on Earth where the past feels older than history says it should be. Places where the stones look like they belong to a forgotten world. And one of the most mysterious of those places is a site that stands in the desert, older than the pyramids, and possibly older than any civilization we were supposed to know about. And one of the most mysterious of those places is a site that stands in the desert, older than the pyramids, and possibly older than any civilization we were supposed to know about. In southeastern Turkey, on a quiet hill that looked ordinary for thousands of years, archaeologists uncovered something that changed the way history is supposed to work. The place is called Göbekli Tepe. At first, it didn't seem like much. Just a mound of earth and stone sitting in dry land where people had farmed for generations. But when researchers began digging, they found enormous carved pillars buried beneath the soil. These weren't small stones. Some of them weighed several tons. They were shaped carefully, placed in circles, and decorated with carvings of animals, symbols, and strange patterns no one fully understands. The biggest surprise wasn't the size. It was the age. Göbekli Tepe is more than 11,000 years old. That makes it older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the first known cities. According to traditional history, humans at that time were supposed to be simple hunter-gatherers, living in small groups, without the ability to build massive structures. And yet, someone built this. Someone cut those stones. Someone moved them. Someone designed those circles with precision. And then, for reasons no one can fully explain, the entire site was buried on purpose, not destroyed. Buried carefully, as if the people who built it wanted it hidden. When discoveries like this appear, they don't prove Atlantis existed, but they do show something important. Human history might be older and more complicated than we once believed. If people were capable of building something like Göbekli Tepe 11,000 years ago, then maybe there were cultures before the ones we usually talk about. Cultures that didn't leave written records. Cultures that disappeared when the climate changed. Cultures that could have inspired stories passed down for thousands of years. And that idea fits very closely with the time Plato said Atlantis existed. He wrote that Atlantis fell about 9,000 years before his time. That would place it roughly at the end of the last ice age, right around the same period when the world was going through massive floods, melting glaciers, and rising seas. Some researchers believe that time may have been one of the most violent periods in human history. There is evidence of sudden climate shifts, huge floods caused by melting ice dams, and even signs that parts of the Earth were hit by fragments of a comet or asteroid. One theory suggests that around 12,000 years ago, pieces of a comet struck the planet, causing fires, floods, and rapid cooling followed by warming. This event is sometimes called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. It's still debated, but there is evidence that something unusual happened during that time. Large animals went extinct, climate changed quickly, and human populations were forced to adapt to a new world. If a civilization existed before that event, it could have been wiped out almost completely, not erased from the planet, but erased from memory. Only stories would remain, stories about a world that existed before the disaster, stories about a time when knowledge was greater, when people built things we no longer understand, when the land itself looked different. And those stories, over thousands of years, could have turned into the legend of Atlantis. There is another strange detail in Plato's description that makes people think the story might have a real origin. He said Atlantis was destroyed in a single day and night of terrible earthquakes and floods. That kind of sudden destruction sounds dramatic. But in nature, events like that do happen. Volcanoes can explode without warning. Earthquakes can sink land. Tsunamis can erase entire cities in minutes. We know this because it has happened in recorded history. The eruption of Krakatoa in 1883 created explosions heard thousands of miles away. The tsunami in 2004 changed coastlines across the Indian Ocean. Entire towns have vanished because the ground beneath them collapsed. If something like that happened thousands of years ago, and if it happened to a place that people believed was powerful or important, the story could survive long after the ruins disappeared. And over time, the story would grow. Details would change. Memories would mix with imagination. facts would blend with myth. But the feeling that something was lost, that might stay the same. And that feeling is exactly what the Atlantis story has. It doesn't sound like a fairy tale. It sounds like a memory that became a legend. Another reason people connect Atlantis to lost ancient knowledge is because of the way early civilizations suddenly seemed to know things. When we look at places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and Mesoamerica, it sometimes feels like complex knowledge appears very quickly. Astronomy, mathematics, architecture, precise alignments with stars. The pyramids in Egypt are built with incredible accuracy. Some ancient temples line up with solstices and equinoxes perfectly. Stone structures around the world show cutting and fitting techniques that are difficult even today. Historians explain this by saying, knowledge developed slowly over time. And that's probably true. But the strange part is that in many places, the earliest known civilizations already seem advanced. It feels like we're missing the beginning of the story. And that's exactly where Atlantis fits in. Not as a magical city, but as a symbol of a lost beginning. A civilization that came before the ones we know. A culture that may have passed knowledge forward. A chapter of history that didn't survive the disasters of the past. There are even theories that some ancient myths about gods teaching humans could be memories of older people sharing knowledge with younger cultures. In Greek stories, the gods taught farming, building, and writing. In Egypt, wisdom was said to come from divine beings. In many traditions, knowledge arrives suddenly, as if given rather than discovered. Some people believe those stories are only myths. Others wonder if they could be echoes of real events, remembered in symbolic ways. If a more advanced culture helped others long ago, and then disappeared, the survivors might describe them as gods. And if that culture was later destroyed, it could become the story of Atlantis. Of course, there is no proof that this happened. But the mystery stays alive because there are just enough strange pieces to keep people wondering. Ancient ruins that seem older than expected. Flood stories from different parts of the world. Maps that don't fit perfectly with history. And a philosopher who wrote about a lost island as if it really existed. When all those things come together, the story starts to feel less like fantasy and more like something half-remembered. Something that almost makes sense, but never completely. And maybe that's why Atlantis is so relaxing to think about. Because it sits in that quiet space between what we know and what we don't. A place where history fades into mystery, and mystery fades into imagination. And the deeper we go into the legend, the stranger the descriptions become. Because Plato didn't only describe Atlantis as powerful, he described it as a civilization that understood nature, energy, and the world itself in ways that sound surprisingly advanced. Because Plato didn't only describe Atlantis as powerful, he described it as a civilization that understood nature, energy, and the world itself in ways that sound surprisingly advanced. According to the story, Atlantis was not just rich or large. It was organized with incredible precision. The capital city itself was built in perfect circles, with rings of land and water surrounding a central island where the main temple stood. Plato wrote that these rings were connected by canals wide enough for ships to pass through, and bridges that allowed people to move easily between them. The layout sounded less like a primitive settlement and more like a carefully planned city. In the center of Atlantis stood a great temple dedicated to Poseidon, the god of the sea. The walls were covered in shining metals, some of which Plato described as more valuable than gold. One of those metals had a strange name, orichalcum. Plato said the Atlanteans mined this metal from the earth, and that it glowed with a fiery light. For a long time, people believed this was just a mythological material, something invented to make the story sound more impressive. But in recent years, archaeologists have found ancient objects made from a metal alloy that some believe could be what the Greeks called orichalcum. It wasn't magical, but it was rare and valuable, and it had a golden shine that would have looked impressive in the ancient world. Findings like that don't prove Atlantis existed, but they make the story feel less impossible, because every time a detail from an old legend turns out to have a real-world connection, the line between myth and history gets a little harder to see. Plato also described Atlantis as a place with advanced engineering. He wrote about harbors large enough for hundreds of ships. He described irrigation systems that carried water across the land. He talked about walls so perfectly built that they lasted for generations. For people living in ancient Greece, those ideas sounded almost unbelievable. But for us today, they sound familiar, because we know civilizations are capable of incredible things. The Romans built roads that lasted thousands of years. The Egyptians moved stones weighing dozens of tons. Ancient cultures understood astronomy with precision that still surprises scientists. So when Plato described a civilization that seemed advanced, it didn't mean they had machines like we do today. It might have meant they had knowledge that was unusual for their time. And if that knowledge existed long before recorded history, it might have been lost when the civilization itself disappeared. Some researchers believe Atlantis represents the memory of a prehistoric culture that reached a high level of organization, then vanished during the great climate changes at the end of the Ice Age. Others believe the story is symbolic, a way for Plato to talk about human pride, power, and the dangers of becoming too greedy. In his story, Atlantis didn't fall only because of natural disaster. It fell because the people became corrupt. Plato wrote that the Atlanteans started as wise and balanced, but over time, they became arrogant. They wanted more power. They tried to conquer other lands, and because of that, the gods decided to punish them. Then came the earthquakes, then the floods, then the island sank beneath the sea. That part of the story sounds like a moral lesson, but even moral lessons can be based on real events. Sometimes history and storytelling mix together until it becomes impossible to separate them. And that's exactly what makes Atlantis so interesting, because every explanation feels possible, but none of them feel complete. Another strange detail in the Atlantis story is the way Plato described the size of the island. He said it was larger than Libya and Asia combined, which sounds enormous. Some historians think this must be an exaggeration or a mistake in translation. Ancient measurements were not always precise, and the meaning of words could change over time. But others think the description might not refer to the Atlantis we imagine. Instead of one island, it could have been a region, a group of lands that existed when sea levels were lower. At the end of the Ice Age, many areas that are now underwater were dry land. The North Sea was once a plain where people lived. Parts of Southeast Asia were connected by land bridges. Coastal regions all over the world extended much farther out than they do today. If there was a large culture living in one of those places, the rising ocean could have swallowed it completely. And thousands of years later, all that would remain would be stories. Stories about a land that disappeared. Stories about people who lived before the flood. Stories about a world that existed before the one we know now. Many ancient traditions talk about something like that. The Greeks had the story of Atlantis. The Mesopotamians told of a great flood. In India, there are texts about lost cities beneath the sea. In the Americas, there are legends about earlier ages of humanity that ended in disaster. When the same kind of story appears again and again, it makes people wonder if they all come from the same distant memory. Not a perfect memory, not an exact record, just a feeling, passed down through generations, that something happened long ago, something big enough that people never forgot it. Another idea that keeps Atlantis alive is the belief that knowledge can be lost. We usually think of history as a straight line, always moving forward. But that's not always how civilizations work. Empires rise, then fall. Knowledge grows, then disappears. Cities are built, then abandoned. The Library of Alexandria once held thousands of ancient texts. Most of them are gone forever. Entire languages have vanished. Technologies have been forgotten. Skills that once existed sometimes have to be rediscovered centuries later. If that can happen in recorded history, it could have happened long before written records existed. There could have been cultures that reached a high level of understanding, then disappeared so completely that almost nothing survived, except stories. And if those stories were told long enough, they could become legends like Atlantis. Some of the more unusual theories say Atlantis might not have been destroyed completely. Instead, some people believe survivors escaped, traveling to other parts of the world, bringing knowledge with them. According to these ideas, the wisdom of Atlantis may have influenced later civilizations. Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, India. There is no clear proof of this, but the idea remains popular because ancient cultures sometimes seem to appear suddenly with advanced skills, writing systems, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture. Historians explain this through gradual development. But mystery lovers sometimes wonder if there was help from people who remembered an older world. Again, it may only be imagination, but imagination is part of what makes the Atlantis story so relaxing to think about, because it lets the mind wander to a time before history, to a world before the maps were finished, to a place where the ocean might still be hiding something no one has seen. And the ocean is exactly where the search for Atlantis always returns. Because if the story is true, the ruins would not be in a desert, or a forest, or a mountain. They would be underwater, somewhere deep, where light never reaches, where the past could stay hidden forever. And over the years, people have searched those depths again and again, looking for anything that might prove the lost city was real. And sometimes, they find things that make the mystery even harder to explain. And sometimes, they find things that make the mystery even harder to explain. The ocean is the largest unexplored place on Earth. It covers most of the planet, yet only a small part of the seafloor has been studied in detail. In many areas, we don't even have clear images of what lies below the water. Instead, we use sonar, sound waves sent down into the darkness, bouncing back to create rough maps of the bottom. Most of the time, those maps show what you would expect: mountains, valleys, volcanoes, endless stretches of sand and rock. But every now and then, something appears that doesn't look natural. Shapes that seem too straight, patterns that look too organized, structures that resemble walls, roads, or ruins. Many of these turn out to have simple explanations. Rock can crack in straight lines. Underwater currents can shape the seafloor in strange ways. Volcanic formations can look almost like buildings. But sometimes the shapes are unusual enough to make people wonder. One of the most famous examples is near the island of Yonaguni in Japan. Divers exploring the ocean floor there discovered a massive stone formation with sharp edges and flat surfaces. It looks like a stepped pyramid with terraces and angles that seem almost carved. Some scientists believe it's a natural rock formation that fractured along straight lines. Others think it could be the remains of something built by people thousands of years ago when sea levels were lower and the area was above water. There is still no agreement, and that uncertainty is exactly the kind of thing that keeps the Atlantis mystery alive, because every unexplained structure becomes a possibility, not proof, just possibility. Another place that often comes up in Atlantis theories is in the Mediterranean Sea. Off the coast of Greece, Egypt, and Italy, archaeologists have found ancient ports and cities that are now underwater. These were not myths. They were real towns that slowly sank because of earthquakes, rising seas, or shifting land. One example is the ancient Egyptian city of Thonis Heraklion. For centuries, it was known only from old writings. Historians weren't even sure it existed. Then, in the year 2000, divers found it beneath the sea. Statues, temples, streets, all lying on the ocean floor. The city had sunk more than 1,000 years ago, and the water preserved many of its structures. Discoveries like that show something important. Cities can disappear completely and still be real. If a place like Thonis could vanish for centuries, it's not impossible that something older could still be hidden. Something deeper, something farther from shore, something no one has found yet. Some Atlantis theories place the lost civilization in the Atlantic Ocean, near the Azores Islands. These islands sit along a volcanic ridge in the middle of the ocean, and some researchers think they could be the remains of a much larger landmass that once existed above water. There is no clear evidence for a sunken continent there, but the location matches Plato's description of Atlantis being beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Because of that, explorers have searched the area many times, hoping to find ruins, walls, or anything that might suggest a lost civilization. So far, nothing definite has been found, but the ocean is huge, and most of it has never been explored closely. Another theory places Atlantis near Antarctica. This idea comes from the strange fact that Antarctica was not always covered in ice. Millions of years ago, it was warmer, with forests and rivers. Of course, that was long before humans existed. But some researchers notice something unusual in old maps. A few ancient maps seem to show the southern continent in a way that looks different from modern Antarctica, almost as if the coastline was drawn before it was covered in ice. Most historians say those maps were guesses, or distortions, or misunderstandings of geography. But mystery theories suggest something else. They suggest that ancient people may have known about land that later became frozen and unreachable. And if knowledge from a very old civilization survived long enough to be copied into later maps, that knowledge might not belong to the civilizations we usually talk about. Ideas like that are impossible to prove, but they keep the Atlantis story alive because they leave space for the unknown. Another reason the Atlantis legend feels so powerful is because of the way humans remember disasters. When something sudden and terrifying happens, people tell stories about it. Floods, volcanoes, earthquakes, storms. Those stories get passed down, generation after generation, sometimes changing a little each time. After hundreds of years, the details become unclear, but the feeling remains, a feeling that something terrible happened long ago. Many cultures have flood stories that sound surprisingly similar. A great storm, rising water, a world destroyed, a few survivors. In the Bible, there is the story of Noah. In Mesopotamia, there is the story of Utnapishtim. In India, there is the story of Manu. In the Americas, there are legends of earlier worlds destroyed by water. These stories were told by people who lived far apart, long before they could communicate with each other. That doesn't mean the stories describe the same event, but it does make people wonder if something happened at the end of the Ice Age that affected many parts of the world. When the glaciers melted, sea levels rose more than 100 meters. Coastal regions where people lived would have flooded slowly, then quickly, then suddenly. If villages, towns, or even larger cultures existed near those coasts, they could have been lost without leaving much behind. Stone sinks, wood rots, metal corrodes. After thousands of years underwater, almost nothing would remain, except stories. Stories about land that disappeared. Stories about people who lived before the flood. Stories about a place that was powerful, then gone. And over time, those stories could become Atlantis. Not a perfect memory, not a precise history, but a legend built from real events, mixed with imagination. There is something strangely comforting about that idea. It reminds us that the world has changed many times before. Civilizations have risen and fallen, long before the ones we learn about in school. And even today, there are places on Earth we still don't fully understand. Deep oceans, buried ruins, ancient structures older than expected. The past is not completely known, and maybe it never will be. That's part of what makes the story of Atlantis so relaxing to think about, because it lives in the unknown, a place where science, history, and imagination overlap, where the answers are never final, and where the mystery can stay alive forever. And the more people search for Atlantis, the more the story seems to change, because some believe the lost city wasn't only destroyed by nature. Some believe it disappeared because its people became too powerful, too advanced, or too dangerous for their own world. And that idea leads to one of the strangest parts of the legend. The belief that Atlantis didn't fall by accident, but because something went wrong. And that idea leads to one of the strangest parts of the legend. The belief that Atlantis didn't fall by accident, but because something went wrong. In Plato's story, the destruction of Atlantis was not only a natural disaster. He wrote that the civilization became proud, greedy, and hungry for power. The Atlanteans, who were once wise and balanced, began to change. They started to conquer other lands. They wanted control over the world beyond their island. And as their power grew, their sense of balance disappeared. According to the story, this is when the gods decided Atlantis had gone too far. Then came the earthquakes, then the floods, then the island sank beneath the sea. For many historians, this part of the story sounds like a lesson, not history. Ancient writers often use stories about lost civilizations to warn people about pride and corruption. But the strange thing is that this same idea appears in many different cultures. Stories about an ancient world that became too powerful, too advanced, or too arrogant, and was destroyed because of it. In Greek mythology, there was a golden age when humans lived in harmony with the gods. Later ages became worse, until disasters reset the world. In Hindu tradition, there are cycles of time called yugas, where civilizations rise, become more complex, then collapse before a new cycle begins. In some Native American stories, there are tales of earlier worlds that were destroyed because people forgot how to live in balance with nature. Even in modern times, people sometimes talk about the idea that civilizations can grow faster than their wisdom. Technology can advance, power can increase, but understanding doesn't always grow at the same speed. Because of that, some people believe the Atlantis story survived not only because of a disaster, but because of a warning about what can happen when knowledge grows without control. This idea has led to some of the more unusual theories about Atlantis, not just a lost island, but a civilization that understood things we don't fully understand today. Some stories say the Atlanteans had knowledge of energy, vibrations, or forces of nature that later cultures forgot. These ideas are not supported by evidence in the scientific sense, but they appear again and again in books, documentaries, and theories about lost civilizations. People talk about crystals that stored energy, machines powered by unknown forces, structures aligned with the Earth in ways that suggest advanced understanding. Most of these ideas come from imagination mixed with real mysteries. Ancient monuments really are aligned with the stars. Old structures really do show incredible precision. Some ancient techniques are still difficult to explain fully, but that doesn't mean the people who built them had futuristic technology. It just means human beings have always been more capable than we sometimes expect. Still, the thought remains. What if there were cultures in the past that knew things differently? Not more advanced in every way, but advanced in ways we lost. History shows that knowledge can disappear, The Romans built concrete that lasted thousands of years, and for centuries, we didn't know exactly how they made it. Ancient sailors crossed oceans without modern instruments. Early astronomers predicted eclipses without computers. When civilizations fall, knowledge doesn't always survive. Libraries burn, cities collapse, languages vanish. If something similar happened long before written history, we might never know how much was lost. And that's one of the reasons Atlantis feels so possible to some people. Not because of magic, not because of science fiction, but because history itself shows that human knowledge can rise and fall more than once. There is another strange part of the Atlantis story that people often forget. Plato said Atlantis was older than any Greek civilization, older even than ancient Egypt, according to the priests who told the story. That would mean the events happened before the oldest written records we have. And if something happened before writing existed, the only way it could survive is through stories. Stories told around fires, stories passed from parents to children, stories repeated until the details change, but the feeling stays. A land lost to water, a world destroyed, a people who knew more than the ones who came after. Over thousands of years, those stories could become myths, and myths could become legends, and legends could become something like Atlantis. Another reason people think the Atlantis story might have some truth behind it is because of how sudden the end of the Ice Age seems to have been. For a long time, scientists thought climate changed slowly, but newer research shows that sometimes the planet can shift very quickly. Temperatures can rise in a few decades. Ice can melt faster than expected. Storms can grow stronger. At the end of the last ice age, sea levels didn't rise smoothly. There were periods when the ocean rose very fast, flooding large areas in a short time. If people were living near the coast when that happened, their homes could have disappeared within generations. Not instantly, but fast enough to feel like the world was ending. Imagine living on land that your grandparents walked across, then watching the sea slowly take it away, year by year, storm by storm, until the place you came from is gone. If you told that story to your children, and they told it to theirs, after many generations, it might sound like a great flood that destroyed everything at once. And if that flood happened to a place that felt powerful or special, it might become the story of a lost civilization, the story of Atlantis. There is something peaceful about thinking of it this way, not as a fantasy, not as a perfect history, but as a memory carried across thousands of years. A memory of a time when the world changed, when the sea rose, when people lost places they thought would always be there. And even today, the ocean keeps its secrets. New ruins are still being discovered underwater. New sites are still being uncovered on land. New evidence keeps changing what we think we know about the past. The deeper we look, the older history seems to become. And the older history becomes, the easier it is to imagine that something like Atlantis could have existed. Maybe not exactly as Plato described it. Maybe not a shining island of perfect circles and golden temples, but a real place, a real culture, a real world that existed before ours. A world that disappeared and left only stories behind. And those stories didn't only survive in books. Some people believe the memory of Atlantis might be hidden in the oldest monuments on Earth, in stones that were placed long before written history, in structures that seem older than the civilizations around them, in places that feel like they belong to a forgotten age. And one of the most mysterious of those places stands in Egypt, watching the desert, as if it has been there longer than anyone remembers. And one of the most mysterious of those places stands in Egypt, watching the desert, as if it has been there longer than anyone remembers. The Great Sphinx sits on the Giza Plateau, not far from the pyramids, carved from a single massive block of stone. It has the body of a lion, the face of a human, and an expression that feels strangely calm, as if it has been watching the world change for thousands of years. According to traditional history, the Sphinx was built more than 4,000 years ago, during the time of the ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids. But some researchers believe it could be older, much older. The reason comes from the marks on the stone itself. On the body of the Sphinx, there are signs of erosion that look like they were caused by water, not wind. Deep grooves run down the sides of the stone, as if heavy rain once poured over it, again and again. Today, the Sphinx sits in the desert, where rain is rare. But thousands of years ago, the climate of Egypt was different. Long before the pyramids were built, the region had more rain, rivers, and grasslands. Some scientists believe the erosion on the Sphinx could come from that much older time. If that idea were true, it would mean the Sphinx might have existed before the civilization we usually connect it to. And if something that large could survive from an earlier age, it makes people wonder what else might have existed back then. Of course, not all archaeologists agree with this theory. Most say the erosion can be explained in other ways, and that the Sphinx really was built during the time of the pyramids. But the fact that the question exists at all shows how much we still don't know. Because history is not a perfect record. It is a puzzle made from broken pieces. Sometimes we find new pieces. Sometimes we realize old pieces were in the wrong place. Sometimes we discover that parts of the puzzle are missing completely. And when pieces are missing, the imagination fills the gaps. That's where Atlantis often appears, not as a proven place, but as a possibility for what those missing pieces might represent. Some people believe that ancient Egypt itself may have inherited knowledge from an earlier culture. There are old Egyptian texts that speak about a time before the dynasties, when gods ruled the land. These stories talk about beings who taught writing, building, astronomy, and law. Historians see these as mythology, symbolic stories about the origins of civilization. But mystery theories suggest something different. They suggest that the gods could have been people from an older culture, remembered in legendary form after their world disappeared. If survivors from a lost civilization traveled to new lands after a disaster, their knowledge might have seemed almost supernatural to the people they met. Over time, stories about teachers could become stories about gods, and stories about a lost homeland could become the legend of Atlantis. This idea appears in many places, not just Egypt. In South America, there are legends of pale, bearded teachers who came from the sea and taught people how to build and farm. In Mesopotamia, there are stories of wise beings who brought knowledge after the flood. In India, ancient texts speak about earlier ages of humanity, destroyed and renewed again and again. None of these prove Atlantis existed, but they show something interesting. Many cultures remember a time before history, a time when the world was different, a time when something was lost. Another reason the Atlantis story keeps returning is because of the way ancient monuments seem to connect to the sky. All over the world, old structures are aligned with stars, planets, or the sun. The pyramids of Giza line up with certain constellations. Stonehenge marks the solstice. Temples in Central America follow the movement of the sun. These alignments show that ancient people understood the sky very well. Some researchers believe this knowledge developed slowly over thousands of years. Others wonder if some of it came from older traditions, passed down from cultures we no longer know. Because the sky changes slowly. Stars move over thousands of years because of the Earth's wobble, a motion called precession. If ancient builders placed structures that match the sky in a way that only fits a very old date, it can make people question when the knowledge first appeared. Some theories suggest that certain alignments point to times long before the pyramids were built. This idea is controversial, and many scientists disagree with it. But it keeps the Atlantis mystery alive, because it suggests the possibility that human history goes back farther than we think. Not millions of years, but maybe thousands more than recorded history shows. And if history goes back farther, there is more time for something to have been lost, more time for a civilization to rise, fall, and leave only stories behind. Another reason Atlantis feels so believable to some people is simple. We know that entire civilizations have disappeared before. The Maya built great cities in the jungle, then abandoned them. The people of Easter Island created enormous statues, then their society collapsed. The Roman Empire controlled huge parts of the world, then slowly fell apart. When those civilizations disappeared, knowledge was lost. Roads broke down, buildings crumbled, languages changed. If that can happen in recorded history, it could have happened earlier too. A culture could have existed before writing, before records, before the stories we know. And if that culture was destroyed by a natural disaster, almost nothing might remain, except legends. Legends told by survivors. Legends passed through generations. Legends that slowly turned into myths. And one of the strongest myths of all is the story of a powerful island, a great civilization, a place that vanished beneath the sea. Atlantis. The more people search for it, the more it seems to move, from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, to Antarctica, to deserts, to mountains, to the deep ocean. It never stays in one place for long, and maybe that's why the mystery never ends. Because Atlantis is not only about a location, it's about the idea that the past might be deeper than we know, that history might have chapters we never read, that somewhere, underwater, under sand, or under ice, there could still be something waiting to be found. And sometimes, the strangest clues don't come from ruins at all. Sometimes they come from old writings, old maps, and stories that seem too detailed to be completely invented. Because long before modern explorers searched the oceans, people were already talking about lost lands beyond the horizon. And some of those stories sound very close to the world Plato described. And some of those stories sound very close to the world Plato described. Long before modern archaeology, long before satellites, long before ships could cross the oceans safely, people were already telling stories about lands that existed somewhere beyond the edge of the known world. In ancient times, maps were not only tools for travel, they were also records of imagination, memory, and rumor. Sailors returned from long journeys with stories of strange islands, unknown continents, and places that seemed almost impossible. Some of those stories were exaggerated, some were misunderstandings, some were probably invented, but every now and then, a story turned out to be true. There were lands people thought were myths, until explorers found them. Because of that, when Plato wrote about Atlantis, many later writers wondered if he might have been describing a real place that no longer existed. In the centuries after his time, the story of Atlantis began to grow. Greek historians repeated it. Roman writers mentioned it. Later scholars argued about whether it was real or symbolic. During the Middle Ages, the story almost disappeared, but it never vanished completely. Then, during the Age of Exploration, when ships began crossing the Atlantic Ocean, the legend returned stronger than ever. Suddenly, people realized how much of the world had been unknown to the ancient Greeks. There really were lands beyond the Western Ocean. There really were continents no one in Europe had known about. And that made people wonder, if Plato talked about an island beyond the known world, maybe he wasn't imagining it. Maybe he had heard about a place that really existed, but was forgotten. When explorers reached the Americas, some believed they might have found the remains of Atlantis. The idea didn't last long, but it showed how easily the story could connect to real discoveries. Every time humans find something new, Atlantis seems to appear again, not as proof, but as a question. What else have we forgotten? Another reason the Atlantis legend stayed alive is because of how detailed Plato's account was. He didn't just describe the island itself, he described its rulers, its armies, its temples, its laws, and even the way its society worked. He said Atlantis was divided into rings of land and water, with the royal palace in the center. He said the people had great ships and traveled far. He said they built walls covered in shining metal and decorated their buildings with carvings and statues. He even described how the land around Atlantis was rich with plants, animals, and minerals. That level of detail makes the story feel less like a simple myth. It feels like something someone tried to remember. Some historians think Plato invented the story to make a point about politics. In his writings, Atlantis represents a powerful society that becomes corrupt, while Athens represents balance and wisdom. In that interpretation, the story is a lesson, not history. But even if Plato used the story as a lesson, that doesn't mean he invented it completely. He said he heard the story from Egyptian priests, who claimed it came from records thousands of years older than Greece. We don't know if that part is true. We don't know if those records ever existed. But the idea that ancient cultures might have known stories older than their own history keeps the mystery alive. Because Egypt itself was already ancient when Greece was young. And before Egypt, there were people whose names we don't know at all. Human history goes back much farther than written history. Writing is only a few thousand years old. Humans have been around for tens of thousands of years. For most of that time, there were no books, no records, no libraries, only stories. Stories told out loud, from one generation to the next. And stories change, details fade, names are forgotten, places move, but the main idea can survive. A great flood, a lost land, a powerful people, a disaster that ended everything. It's possible that the Atlantis story is one of those memories, not a perfect record, but an echo of something that happened so long ago that only the outline remained. There is another reason people connect Atlantis to real history. At the end of the Ice Age, the world experienced something called meltwater pulses. These were periods when the sea level rose very quickly, sometimes several meters in a short time. Scientists know this because of coral reefs and geological evidence. When the ice melted, huge amounts of water poured into the oceans. Coastal plains flooded. Islands disappeared. Shorelines moved inland. Places where people once lived became part of the sea. If a large settlement existed on one of those coasts, it could have been lost completely. After thousands of years underwater, there might be no trace left, except stories. Stories about the land that was swallowed by the ocean. Stories about a time before the flood. Stories about a civilization that lived in a world that no longer exists. Some researchers believe Atlantis might represent not one single city, but the memory of many lost places combined into one legend. Different floods, different disasters, different cultures disappearing over time, all remembered together as one great story. And when Plato wrote it down, he gave that story a name. Atlantis. There is something strangely peaceful about the idea, not because of the destruction, but because it reminds us that the world is always changing. Oceans rise, land sinks, civilizations grow and fall. Nothing stays exactly the same forever. And somewhere in that long history, there could have been a place that was real once, but isn't anymore. A place that existed before maps, before books, before the world we know. A place remembered only in stories told long ago. And even today, people still search for it. Ships scan the ocean floor. Archaeologists dig in deserts. Researchers study ancient texts and old maps. Every generation looks again, just in case the lost city is still waiting to be found. And sometimes, the strangest clues don't come from the ocean at all. Sometimes, they come from the sky. Because some researchers believe the fall of Atlantis might not have been caused only by floods or earthquakes, but by something that came from above. Because some researchers believe the fall of Atlantis might not have been caused only by floods or earthquakes, but by something that came from above. At the end of the last ice age, the Earth went through a period of sudden and dramatic change. For a long time, scientists believed this change happened slowly, over thousands of years. But newer evidence suggests that some parts of the transition may have happened much faster than anyone expected. Temperatures dropped suddenly, large animals disappeared, glaciers shifted, oceans rose. This mysterious period is known as the Younger Dryas. It began around 12,000 years ago, and for reasons that are still debated, the climate cooled again after a long warming trend. Then, just as suddenly, the cold ended, and the world warmed quickly. One theory suggests that this sudden change may have been caused by something striking the Earth. Not a huge asteroid like the one that ended the age of the dinosaurs, but fragments of a comet breaking apart in the atmosphere or hitting the ice sheets that covered much of the northern hemisphere. According to this idea, the impacts could have caused massive fires, floods, and climate shifts all at once. Huge amounts of ice could have melted quickly. Rivers could have overflowed. The ocean could have risen faster than people could escape. If something like that really happened, it would have been one of the most terrifying events humans had ever experienced. And if people survived it, they would remember. They might not remember the science. They wouldn't know about comets or climate systems. But they would remember the feeling, the sky burning, the ground shaking, the water rising. And over generations, those memories could turn into stories about a world destroyed by the gods, or by the heavens, or by a great catastrophe. Stories like the flood myths, stories like the end of a golden age, stories like Atlantis. The Younger Dryas impact theory is still controversial. Many scientists think the evidence isn't strong enough yet. Others believe something unusual really did happen at the end of the Ice Age, even if the exact cause isn't clear. What makes the idea interesting for the Atlantis mystery is the timing. If Plato's date for Atlantis is taken literally, the destruction would have happened around the same period when the climate was changing rapidly and sea levels were rising. That doesn't prove anything, but it places the legend in a time when the world really was unstable. A time when coastlines disappeared. A time when people had to move. A time when entire ways of life could have been lost. Another strange detail in ancient stories is how often they talk about fire from the sky. In Greek myths, Zeus used lightning to destroy cities. In Hindu texts, there are descriptions of weapons that shine like the sun. In some Native American stories, the sky falls or burns. Most historians see these as symbolic language, but sometimes real events can inspire symbolic stories. Meteor impacts have happened many times in Earth's history. Volcanic eruptions can darken the sky. Comets can appear suddenly and look terrifying to people who don't know what they are. If a bright object crossed the sky, followed by earthquakes or floods, it would feel like the heavens themselves caused the disaster. And if that disaster destroyed a powerful culture, the story could survive for thousands of years. Some researchers believe Atlantis might have been one of the civilizations living near the coasts at the end of the Ice Age. Not a perfect, magical kingdom, but a real society that knew how to build, farm, and travel. When the climate changed, when the seas rose, when disasters struck, that society could have been lost. Survivors might have traveled to other lands. They might have told stories about the place they came from. Stories about a great island. Stories about advanced knowledge. Stories about a disaster that happened in a single terrible night. Over time, those stories could have spread across different cultures, each culture adding its own details, each generation changing the story a little, until one day, a philosopher in Greece heard the story from Egyptian priests. and wrote it down. And because he wrote it down, the story never disappeared. That's one of the most important parts of the Atlantis mystery. Most stories from ancient times are gone forever. We only know the ones someone decided to write. If Plato had never mentioned Atlantis, the legend might not exist today. There could be hundreds of stories like it that were never recorded. Lost memories of places no one remembers anymore. Lost names of cultures that vanished before history began. That thought makes the world feel much older and much deeper than the version of history we usually learn. It also makes the ocean feel different. When you look at the sea, it doesn't feel empty. It feels like it's covering something. Ancient coastlines, buried forests, ruins no one has seen. We know for a fact that there are cities underwater. We know the shoreline used to be farther out. We know the world looked different 10,000 years ago. And because we know those things, Atlantis doesn't feel impossible. It feels like a question we haven't answered yet. Maybe the story is exaggerated. Maybe the details changed. Maybe the real place wasn't as grand as the legend says. But somewhere, sometime, there may have been a culture that lived in a world we can't see anymore. A world swallowed by the ocean. A world remembered only in stories. A world that people kept talking about because losing it felt too big to forget. And the strange thing is, the more scientists discover about the past, the more we realize how much we still don't know. New ruins appear. New dates change the timeline. New evidence shows that human history is older than we thought. Every discovery pushes the beginning farther back. And the farther back it goes, the more space there is for something like Atlantis to have existed. Not as a fantasy, not as a perfect story, but as a real place, lost in a time when the world itself was changing. And even now, there are researchers, explorers, and dreamers who still believe the final clue hasn't been found yet. Because somewhere on Earth, there might still be a place that doesn't fit the history books. A place that feels older than it should. A place that looks like it belongs to a forgotten world. And some people believe one of those places might be hidden in the middle of the ocean, on a strange group of islands, where the land rises from deep water, exactly where Plato said Atlantis once stood. And some people believe one of those places might be hidden in the middle of the ocean, on a strange group of islands, where the land rises from deep water, exactly where Plato said Atlantis once stood. In the Atlantic Ocean, far from the coasts of Europe and Africa, there is a chain of volcanic islands known as the Azores. Today, they belong to Portugal, and they look peaceful. Green hills, cliffs, and quiet towns surrounded by endless water. But what makes the Azores interesting to Atlantis researchers is their location. They sit close to the area where Plato described the lost island. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, past the narrow entrance of the Mediterranean, in the wide ocean, where the ancient Greeks believed the world ended. Because of that, some people wonder if the Azores could be the highest points of land from something much larger that once existed. Not a continent in the way old legends imagined, but maybe a region of islands and plains that were above water when sea levels were lower. At the end of the Ice Age, the ocean rose more than 100 meters. That is enough to cover enormous areas of land, places where people once could have lived, places where towns could have existed, places that today lie far below the surface. Scientists say there is no evidence of a sunken continent near the Azores, and modern geology shows that the Atlantic Ocean floor is very old and shaped by slow-moving plates. But the mystery remains, because the ocean is vast, and only small parts of it have been explored closely. When sonar scans the seabed, it sometimes reveals strange shapes. Underwater mountains, flat plateaus, ridges that look almost like they were carved. Most of these have natural explanations, but to people searching for Atlantis, Every unusual formation feels like a clue, because the legend never pointed to an exact location. It only gave hints. An island beyond the known world, a powerful civilization, a sudden disaster. Those hints can fit many places. Another theory places Atlantis not in the Atlantic, but in the Mediterranean Sea, connected to one of the most dramatic disasters in ancient history. Around 1600 BCE, the island of Thera, now called Santorini, experienced a massive volcanic eruption. The explosion was so powerful that it blew apart much of the island and sent ash across the region. Huge waves spread through the Mediterranean, damaging cities along the coasts. At the time, a civilization called the Minoans lived on nearby islands. They were skilled sailors, builders, and traders, and their cities were advanced for their time. After the eruption, their culture began to decline. Some historians believe this event may have inspired the Atlantis story. A powerful island, a sudden destruction, a civilization that disappeared. The timing is not exactly the same as Plato described, but stories can change over hundreds of years. A real disaster could have been remembered, retold, and eventually written down in a different form. This explanation is popular because it connects the legend to something we know really happened, but it doesn't explain everything. Plato said Atlantis existed long before his time, much earlier than the Minoan civilization, and he described the island as being beyond the Mediterranean, not inside it. Because of that, the Santorini theory feels possible, but not complete. There are also theories that place Atlantis in places far from Greece. Some say it was in the Caribbean. Some say near South America. Some say under the Sahara, which was once a green land full of rivers and lakes. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. It had grasslands, animals, and people living there. Over time, the climate changed, the rain stopped, and the land became dry. If a culture existed there long ago, it could have disappeared as the environment changed. Stories about that lost land might have traveled across continents, changing along the way. By the time they reached Greece, the details could have been different, but the idea of a vanished world might have stayed the same. Another reason Atlantis keeps moving from place to place is simple. No one has ever found proof. There is no single ruin, no clear record, no object that everyone agrees belongs to Atlantis. And because there is no final answer, the mystery stays open. People can imagine it in the ocean, under the ice, beneath the sand, or in a place no one has searched yet. Sometimes the mystery feels stronger than the solution, because once something is explained completely, the wonder disappears. Atlantis has never been explained completely. It stays just out of reach, close enough to feel possible, far enough to stay mysterious. And maybe that is why the story never fades. It speaks to a feeling that history might be deeper than we think, that the world has changed more times than we remember, that somewhere in the past, there could have been a civilization that rose, shined brightly, and then vanished. Not because of magic, not because of fantasy, but because the earth itself is always changing. Mountains rise, oceans move, climates shift, and when the world changes, people have to change with it. Sometimes they survive, sometimes they don't, and when they don't, all that remains are stories. Stories about lost lands, stories about ancient knowledge, stories about a place that was once powerful, and then disappeared in a single terrible moment. The story of Atlantis is one of those stories. But there is one more reason the legend refuses to disappear. Because some people believe the clues to Atlantis are not only in the ocean, and not only in ancient texts, but in the patterns hidden all across the earth itself. Patterns in monuments, patterns in numbers, patterns in the way ancient civilizations built their world. And when people start looking at those patterns, the mystery becomes even stranger. And when people start looking at those patterns, the mystery becomes even stranger. All around the world, there are ancient monuments that seem too precise for their time. Massive stones cut with incredible accuracy, structures aligned with the stars, buildings placed in ways that appear carefully measured, as if the people who built them understood the world with surprising detail. Most historians explain this through patience, skill, and generations of learning. Ancient builders didn't need modern machines to create impressive things. They had time, knowledge, and thousands of workers. But some researchers believe there is something more. They notice patterns that seem to connect different civilizations, even when those civilizations lived far apart and had no known contact with each other. The pyramids in Egypt, the temples in Central America, stone circles in Europe, ancient sites in Asia. In many of these places, the structures line up with the sun, the moon, or certain stars. At the pyramids of Giza, the layout of the 3 largest pyramids appears to match the pattern of the stars in Orion's belt, at least roughly. Some believe this was intentional, a way to connect the monuments to the sky. Other ancient sites also show alignments with solstices or equinoxes, marking the changing seasons with surprising precision. This tells us something important. Ancient people watched the sky very carefully. They tracked the movement of the sun and stars for thousands of years. They built calendars, predicted seasons, and used the heavens to guide their lives. That alone is impressive. But some mystery theories suggest that this knowledge might be older than the civilizations we usually credit. The idea is not that ancient people had modern technology. It's that knowledge may have been passed down from earlier cultures that disappeared. If a civilization existed before the end of the Ice Age, and if some of its people survived, they could have shared what they knew with later societies. Over time, that knowledge might have become part of new cultures, without anyone remembering where it originally came from. This idea appears in many different stories. In Egypt, the gods were said to teach wisdom. In Mesopotamia, knowledge came from divine beings after the flood. In Greece, the Titans and older races existed before the current age. These stories don't prove anything, but they show that ancient people themselves believed there were worlds before their own. Worlds that ended, worlds that were forgotten. And that idea fits perfectly with the legend of Atlantis. Another strange detail people talk about is the idea of a lost golden age. Many ancient cultures describe a time when humans lived differently, a time when life was easier, when knowledge was greater, when people lived closer to nature or closer to the gods. In Greek mythology, the golden age came before the present age. In Hindu tradition, earlier ages were said to be more advanced spiritually and physically. In other cultures, there are stories of earlier worlds destroyed by disaster. Historians see these as symbolic stories about how people think the past was better. But mystery theories see them as something else. They see them as memories, memories of a time before history, memories of a civilization that existed long ago, then disappeared, memories of Atlantis. Of course, there is no clear evidence that such a civilization existed, but the idea feels possible because we know history is incomplete. We know there were people living on Earth long before writing began. We know that coastlines were different. We know that entire regions are now underwater, and we know that knowledge can be lost. When the Roman Empire fell, much of its knowledge disappeared for centuries. When libraries burned, books vanished forever. When cities were abandoned, their stories faded. If something similar happened 10,000 years ago, almost nothing would remain, except myths, except legends, except stories like Atlantis. There is another pattern that keeps people thinking about lost civilizations. Sometimes, when archaeologists discover something new, it turns out to be older than expected. Ruins that don't fit the timeline, Tools that appear before the culture we thought invented them. Structures that seem too advanced for their age. Most of the time, these discoveries don't change history completely. They just show that the story is more complicated. But every time the timeline moves back a little, Atlantis feels a little less impossible. Not because there is proof, but because there is space. Space in the past where something unknown could have existed. And the farther back we go, the less we know for certain. Beyond written history, there are thousands of years we only understand in pieces. Beyond that, there are tens of thousands of years where almost everything is guesswork. And in that long stretch of time, a civilization could rise, fall, and leave only traces too small to recognize. That is why Atlantis never disappears. It lives in that space between what we know and what we don't. It lives in the unanswered questions. It lives in the feeling that the past might still be hiding something. Something under the ocean, something under the sand, something buried so deeply that we may never find it. And yet people keep looking. They scan the seabed. They study ancient texts. They dig in deserts. They compare myths from different cultures. Not because they are certain Atlantis existed, but because the mystery feels too big to ignore. Because every now and then, history surprises us. Every now and then, we find something we didn't expect. And every time that happens, the legend of Atlantis comes back again. Quietly, patiently, waiting for the day when someone might discover something that doesn't fit the story we thought we knew. And if that day ever comes, it might not be a golden city or a perfect island. It might be something small, a ruin under the sea, a structure older than it should be, a clue that shows the past was different from what we believed. And if that happens, the legend of Atlantis might not feel like a legend anymore. It might feel like a memory of a world that existed long ago, before the oceans rose, before history began, before the stories were written. And maybe, somewhere beneath the waves, that world is still there. And maybe, somewhere beneath the waves, that world is still there. The ocean has a way of hiding things. Water covers more than 70% of the Earth, and most of it is deeper than we can easily explore. Even with modern technology, the bottom of the sea is still one of the least understood places on the planet. There are trenches deeper than mountains at all. There are valleys wider than entire countries. There are plains of sand stretching farther than the eye could ever see. If a city sank thousands of years ago, if an island disappeared when the sea rose, if a civilization was lost at the end of the Ice Age, the ocean could have covered it completely. Not just hidden it, protected it. Underwater, ruins can survive longer than they would on land. Sand can bury them. Coral can grow over them. Layers of sediment can seal them away, untouched for thousands of years. We already know this has happened. Divers have found ancient ports beneath the Mediterranean, sunken temples near the coast of India, old roads and walls under shallow seas where people once lived. Each discovery reminds us that the world used to look different. Places that are underwater today were once dry land. People walked there, built there, lived there, and when the water came, they had to leave, or they didn't. That idea is one of the reasons Atlantis never stops feeling possible, because we know the sea has swallowed real places before. Not legends, real places, real cities, real homes. If that can happen in recorded history, it could have happened long before anyone was writing things down. And if it happened long before writing, the only record would be stories. Stories that changed as they were told. Stories that became myths. Stories that became the legend of a lost island. Another reason the Atlantis mystery stays alive is because of how little we still understand about the ancient world. New discoveries are made every year. Ruins older than expected. tools more advanced than they should be. Sites buried under sand or jungle for thousands of years. Sometimes archaeologists find entire cities that no one knew existed, not because they were hidden on purpose, but because time covered them, wind covered them, sand covered them, water covered them. If a place as large as a city can disappear, it's not hard to imagine something even older disappearing completely. And the older something is, the harder it becomes to find. Wood rots, metal rusts, stone breaks. After 10,000 years, even a great civilization might leave only a few pieces behind. Pieces too small to recognize. Pieces that look like natural rock. Pieces that don't seem important until someone looks closer. That's why the search for Atlantis has never really ended. Not because everyone believes it was real, but because the possibility is still there. There is still space in history where something could have existed. There are still parts of the Earth we haven't explored. There are still questions we can't fully answer. And as long as those things remain, the story of Atlantis will remain too. Some people imagine Atlantis as a shining city of crystal towers and advanced machines. Others imagine it as a simple island culture, skilled and organized, living in a world that changed too fast. Some think it was one place. Some think it was many places remembered as one. Some think it never existed at all, but represents the idea that civilizations can rise and fall. In a strange way, all of those ideas can exist at the same time. Because Atlantis is not only about history, it's about the feeling that the past is deeper than we see, that the world has lived many different lives before this one, that somewhere in the long stretch of time behind us, there were stories we never heard, people we never learned about, places that vanished before anyone could write their names down. That thought can feel mysterious, but it can also feel peaceful, because it reminds us that the world is bigger than what we know, older than what we remember, and full of secrets we may never completely understand. Sometimes, it's comforting to imagine that not everything has been discovered yet, that there are still hidden places, still forgotten worlds, still stories waiting under the ocean, or under the sand, or under the ice. And maybe Atlantis is one of those stories that survived because it was too powerful to disappear completely. Not powerful because of technology, not powerful because of magic, but powerful because people kept telling it. For thousands of years, someone always remembered the story of a lost land, a land beyond the horizon, a land that sank beneath the sea, a land that once existed and then was gone. And as long as people keep wondering about the past, as long as the ocean keeps its secrets, as long as history still has missing pages, the story of Atlantis will never really end. It will stay right where it has always been, somewhere between myth and memory, somewhere between history and imagination, somewhere in the quiet place where the mind drifts and wonders what the world was like, long before we were here. And when you think about it long enough, it almost feels like Atlantis isn't only a lost city. It feels like a reminder that nothing lasts forever. Not islands, not civilizations, not even the shape of the earth itself. Everything changes. Everything moves. Everything eventually becomes part of the past. And sometimes, the past sinks so deep that all we can do is listen to the stories it left behind. And sometimes, the past sinks so deep that all we can do is listen to the stories it left behind. There is something strangely calming about the idea that the world has lived many different lives before this one, that the land we walk on today has been ocean before, and that the ocean we see now was once dry ground. When you think about the earth over thousands of years, it doesn't feel solid and permanent anymore. It feels slow, quiet, always changing. Mountains rise, rivers move, deserts appear where forests once grew, and the sea slowly takes back the land. If Atlantis existed, it wouldn't be the only place the ocean has claimed. It would just be the one we still remember. One of the reasons the legend has lasted so long is because it touches something deep in the human mind. The idea that there was once a place more advanced, more peaceful, or more powerful than the world we know now, and that it disappeared. Almost every culture has some version of that idea. A golden age, a lost world, a time when life was different. In Greek stories, people spoke of an age when humans lived without suffering. In Hindu tradition, earlier ages of the world were said to be greater than the current one. In many flood myths, there is always a world before the flood, and another world after it. These stories don't have to describe the same event to feel connected. They all carry the same feeling, that something existed long ago, and that it didn't survive. That feeling makes Atlantis more than just a story about a city. It becomes a story about change, about time moving forward no matter what we build, about how even the strongest civilizations can disappear. History shows this again and again. Cities that once seemed eternal are now ruins. Empires that ruled the world are now names in books. Places that felt permanent were gone before anyone realized they could fall. If that can happen in a few thousand years, imagine what could happen in 10,000 or 20,000. There could have been cultures we never learned about. People who lived, built, explored, and disappeared before writing began. Their tools could have broken down. Their homes could have turned to dust. Their stories could have survived only as myths. And one of those myths might be Atlantis. There is another reason the legend feels so powerful. It makes the world feel bigger. When everything is explained, the world feels smaller. When every place is mapped, every date known, every question answered, there is less room for wonder. Atlantis keeps the wonder alive. It reminds us that the past is not completely solved, that the earth still has secrets, that there are still things hidden under the ocean, under the sand, under layers of time. And even if Atlantis never existed exactly as the story says, the mystery itself is real. We know the ocean hides ruins. We know sea levels changed. We know ancient cultures disappeared. We know history is incomplete. Those facts alone are enough to keep the legend alive. Some people search for Atlantis because they want proof. Others search because they like the feeling of not knowing, because the idea of a lost world is peaceful in a strange way. It lets the mind drift far away from the present, far away from noise, far away from problems, to a time so distant that nothing from today exists there. Just ocean, just sky, just the memory of something that used to be. Imagine standing on a shoreline 10,000 years ago. The air is different. The land stretches farther than it does today. Places that are underwater now are dry and full of life. People live there. They build homes. They light fires at night. They watch the stars the same way we do. They don't know the world is about to change. They don't know the ice will melt, that the sea will rise, that storms will come. They only know the world as it is. And then, slowly, it begins to disappear. The water comes closer every year. Land turns to marsh. Marsh turns to sea. Villages move inland. Some leave, some stay. And after many years, the place where they lived is gone. All that remains is the story. A story told to children. A story told again and again. A story about the land that sank. About the world before the flood. About the time when everything changed. After hundreds of years, the story sounds different. After thousands, it becomes a legend. After even longer, it becomes Atlantis. Maybe not the exact Atlantis Plato described. Maybe not a perfect island with shining temples, but a memory of a real change, a real loss, A real moment when the world moved on and people had to move with it. And the strange thing is, that kind of change never stopped happening. Even now, the Earth is still shifting. Ice melts, oceans rise, cities sink slowly into the ground. Nothing stays exactly the same forever. Atlantis feels mysterious because it reminds us of that, because it shows that the past is not frozen. It's moving, just like the present. And somewhere, under the surface of the ocean, there may still be places no one has seen, places where the sand covers old stone, places where ruins rest in silence, places where history ended and the story began. And maybe that is why the legend never fades, because it doesn't only belong to the past. It belongs to the feeling that the world is older than we know, deeper than we understand, and still full of secrets waiting in the dark. And maybe that is why the legend never fades, because it doesn't only belong to the past. It belongs to the feeling that the world is older than we know, deeper than we understand, and still full of secrets waiting in the dark. When people imagine Atlantis, they often picture a shining island, full of towers, temples, and perfect cities. A place where knowledge was greater, where life was balanced, where people understood the world in a way we don't anymore. But the truth is, the real mystery of Atlantis is not what the city looked like. It's why the story survived. Thousands of years have passed since Plato wrote about the lost island, and yet the legend never disappeared. Empires have fallen, languages have changed, entire cultures have vanished, but the story of Atlantis stayed. That alone is unusual. Most ancient stories fade away. Some are forgotten completely. Some survive only in fragments. Atlantis never did. Every generation finds it again. Ancient philosophers talked about it. Explorers searched for it. Writers imagined it. Scientists tried to explain it. Even today, people still wonder if there is something hidden in the past that we haven't found yet. Part of the reason is simple. Atlantis sits right at the edge of what we know. Not proven, not impossible, just uncertain enough to stay interesting. We know the sea level rose after the Ice Age. We know people lived on land that is now underwater. We know disasters have destroyed cities before. We know history is incomplete. Because of that, Atlantis never feels completely impossible. It feels like a missing page, a chapter torn out of the story before anyone could read it. And when something is missing, the mind wants to fill the gap. Some people imagine Atlantis as a highly advanced civilization, with knowledge lost to time. Others imagine it as a normal culture, living in a world that changed too fast. Some think it was one island. Some think it was many places remembered as one. Some think it never existed at all, and that the story survives because humans always wonder about the past. All of those ideas can exist at the same time. Because Atlantis is not only about history, it's about imagination. It's about the feeling you get when you look at the ocean and realize how much is hidden under the surface. When you stand on a beach and look at the horizon, it feels like there could be anything out there. An island no one has seen. A ruin under the waves. A place that existed long ago and never came back. The ocean makes the world feel bigger, and Atlantis lives in that feeling. There is also something peaceful about thinking of lost civilizations, not because of the destruction, but because it reminds us that nothing lasts forever. The world changes slowly, then suddenly. Forests become deserts, lakes become dry land, cities become ruins. Even the strongest things eventually become part of the past. That might sound sad, but it can also feel calm, because it means the world keeps moving. It means every moment is part of something larger. Atlantis is a story about a civilization that reached its height and then disappeared. Not because the story needs a villain, not because the world ended, but because time never stops. The same ocean that hides Atlantis today has been moving for millions of years. Waves come in, waves go out, year after year, century after century. And under those waves, the past rests quietly, not gone, just out of reach. Sometimes scientists will find a ruin underwater, and for a moment, it feels like the mystery is about to be solved. A wall, a road, a statue. But every discovery leads to more questions. How old is it? Who built it? What was there before? The deeper we look into history, the more we realize how much we don't know. And that is exactly the place where Atlantis lives. Not in certainty, not in proof, in the space between. The space where stories survive because no one can fully explain them. And maybe that's the best place for a story like this, because if Atlantis were found tomorrow, if someone discovered the exact ruins, the exact island, the exact truth, the mystery would end. The legend would become history, and something about it would be lost. Part of what makes Atlantis so relaxing to think about is that it never has to end. It can stay in the distance. It can stay under the water. It can stay in the quiet part of the mind where questions don't need answers. Just the feeling that the world is older than we see, that the past is deeper than we know, that somewhere, far below the surface, there might still be a place that belonged to another age. A place where people lived, built, dreamed, and disappeared. A place remembered only because someone told the story, and someone else kept telling it after them. And after thousands of years, the story is still here, still drifting across time, still waiting in the dark water, still whispering the same question people have asked for centuries. What if Atlantis was real? And even if we never know the answer, the mystery itself might be the reason the story was never meant to disappear. And even if we never know the answer, the mystery itself might be the reason the story was never meant to disappear. There are some stories that stay with humanity no matter how much time passes. They don't belong to one country, one language, or one generation. They move quietly through history, changing shape, but never fading completely. Atlantis is one of those stories. It began with a philosopher writing about a lost island, but it didn't stay there. Over the centuries, the idea grew larger than the original words. It became a symbol of something deeper, the feeling that the past holds secrets we haven't uncovered yet. Every time the world seems fully mapped, fully explained, and fully understood, something appears that reminds us it isn't. A ruin older than expected. A structure built in a way we don't fully understand. A story that shows up in different cultures with the same strange details. Those moments don't prove Atlantis existed, but they keep the door open. And as long as the door stays open, the legend keeps breathing. There is something about lost civilizations that makes the mind slow down. Maybe it's because they exist so far away from the present that nothing from daily life can follow us there. When you think about Atlantis, you're not thinking about today. You're not thinking about tomorrow. You're thinking about a world that may have existed thousands of years ago, under a sky that looked the same, but over land that no longer exists. Imagine an island rising from the ocean long before recorded history. The air is warm. The sea stretches endlessly in every direction. The people living there don't know they will become a legend. They build their homes. They carve stone. They watch the stars at night. They think the world will always stay the way it is. And then something changes. Maybe the ground shakes. Maybe the water rises slowly. Maybe storms come stronger each year. No one realizes at first that the change won't stop. But it doesn't. The land gets smaller. The sea gets closer. The sky feels different. And one day, the place they lived is gone. Not erased from the earth completely, but erased from the world they knew. Some survive. They travel to other lands. They tell the story of where they came from. They tell it again, and again, and again. The story changes a little each time. The island becomes larger, The people become wiser. The disaster becomes greater. After many generations, the story doesn't sound like a memory anymore. It sounds like a myth. And after even more time, it becomes the legend of Atlantis. That idea feels believable, not because we have proof, but because it matches the way humans remember things. We don't remember every detail. We remember feelings. We remember the important parts. We remember that something happened. And when enough people remember the same kind of story, it survives. There is also something comforting about the idea that the world has always been changing. It means nothing we see today is permanent, but it also means nothing is completely lost. Even when cities fall, even when cultures disappear, something remains. A story, a ruin, a mark in the ground, a line in an old book. Atlantis may be one of those marks, not a perfect record of the past, but a sign that something happened long ago that people never forgot. The ocean makes the story feel even more real. When you look at the sea, it feels endless. It feels like it could hide anything. Under those waves, there are mountains taller than anything on land. There are valleys deeper than we can easily reach. There are places no human has ever seen. If a civilization sank there thousands of years ago, it might still be there now, silent, covered in sand, resting in darkness where nothing changes. And maybe that's why the legend feels peaceful instead of frightening. Because Atlantis is not just about destruction, it's about time, about how the world moves forward no matter what happens, about how every age becomes the past, about how every civilization, no matter how powerful, eventually becomes a story. When you think about it like that, Atlantis doesn't feel like a tragedy. It feels like part of the natural rhythm of the world. Things rise, things fall, things are forgotten, and sometimes, something is remembered just enough to keep the mystery alive. That mystery is what keeps people searching. Not because they need to prove the story true, but because the idea that something is still hidden makes the world feel larger. It makes history feel deeper. It makes the ocean feel like it still has secrets. And maybe it always will, because even with all the maps we have, even with all the technology, even with everything we think we know, there are still places on Earth no one has explored, still questions no one has answered, still stories that refuse to disappear. And Atlantis is one of them. A lost island, a lost civilization, a lost moment in time that never completely faded away. And after thousands of years, the story is still here, floating quietly between myth and memory, waiting in the deep water where the past never fully sinks. And after thousands of years, the story is still here, floating quietly between myth and memory, waiting in the deep water where the past never fully sinks. By now, the legend of Atlantis feels less like a single story and more like a shadow that stretches across all of history. It touches ancient Greece, Egypt, flood myths, lost cities, strange ruins, and the endless ocean that still covers most of the Earth. Whether Atlantis was real or not, the reason it never disappeared may be simple. It reminds us that the world is older than we can imagine, older than books, older than maps, older than anything we can easily prove. There was a time before writing, before cities, before the civilizations we learn about in history. And in that time, people lived entire lives we know almost nothing about. They walked on land that is now underwater. They watched stars from places that no longer exist. They built things that may have been lost long before anyone could record them. If something important happened back then, if a place really was destroyed by rising seas, earthquakes, or fire from the sky, the only way it could survive would be through stories. Stories told in different languages, stories told in different lands, stories told so many times that the details changed, but the feeling stayed the same. A feeling that there was once a place, and that place is gone. That feeling became Atlantis. Plato gave it a name, but the idea behind it may be much older than his words. Older than Greece, older than Egypt, maybe older than anything we can trace with certainty. And that is why the legend feels different from ordinary myths. It sits right on the edge of possibility, not proven, not impossible, just far enough away that the mind can wander there without ever reaching the end. Over the centuries, people have searched for Atlantis in every part of the world, in the Atlantic Ocean, in the Mediterranean, under the sands of the Sahara, near Antarctica, in the Caribbean, beneath the deep ocean where no one has explored. Every search ends the same way, with more questions. But the questions are part of the reason the story survives, because the world still has places we haven't seen, still has ruins we haven't uncovered, still has mysteries we don't understand. Every time a new discovery is made, history becomes a little deeper. Every time the timeline moves back, there is more room for something forgotten. And in that space, Atlantis lives, not as a proven city, not as a perfect legend, but as a reminder that the past is never completely finished, that there may always be chapters we don't know about. There is something peaceful about that thought. It means the world is still full of wonder, still full of hidden places, still full of stories waiting under the surface. When you imagine Atlantis now, it doesn't have to be a shining island or a lost empire. It can simply be a symbol of how time moves, how the earth changes, how everything eventually becomes part of the past. The ocean rises, the land sinks, civilizations grow and then fade, but the stories stay. And sometimes, the stories last longer than the things they describe. Somewhere beneath the waves, there may be ruins that no one has seen. Somewhere under the sand, there may be traces of people whose names are gone. Somewhere in the long stretch of time before history, there may have been a world we will never fully understand. Atlantis represents that world. A place that may have existed, or may only live in memory, but feels real enough that people never stopped wondering about it. And maybe that is exactly where the story belongs. Not solved, not proven, not forgotten, just drifting quietly through time, like something resting far below the ocean, where the water is still, the light is gone, and the past waits in silence. So, as the night gets quieter and the world slows down, you can let the mystery stay where it is, somewhere beyond the horizon, somewhere under the sea, somewhere in the part of history we can't quite reach. The lost island, the forgotten world, the story that never completely faded. Atlantis.